Welcome to the OneHaas Alumni Podcast. In celebration of Pride Month, we have with us a very special guest today, Stacy Nathaniel Jackson, a fellow Haas alum from the class of 1990. After a successful career in senior positions in corporate and nonprofit, Stacy is today an author, artist, and activist. As an African-American transgender artist activist, he has served on various community boards, including mayoral appointee of the San Francisco Transgender Civil Rights Implementation Task Force, UCSF Chancellor's GLBT Advisory Committee, San Francisco LGBT Community Center Project, and former board president of Fresh Meat Productions, a leading transgender and queer performing arts nonprofit. We also welcome on our show today my guest co-host, Elida Bautista.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, Sean. I'm Elida Bautista, Director of Inclusion and Diversity at the Haas School of Business. I've been here a couple years now, focused primarily on the student experience across our degree programs and various units that interface from recruitment to alumni.
And welcome, Stacy.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure being here as a 60-year-old 1990 Haas alum. I'm pleased to share my experiences with you. And Olivia and I, we met at UCSF. So I am a student of yours of diversity and inclusion, the certificate program at UCSF.
Yes, that's our connection. This is maybe 3 or 4 years ago now. I guess It would be easily 4 years ago.
I've been retired about a year and a half.
Wow. So Stacy, really embodying student always.
Yes. Yeah, it was a pretty intense certificate program that I designed specifically for staff at UCSF. Mm-hmm. And there was a small group of maybe 20 in our cohort, a lot of sharing of our lived experiences, a lot of soul searching. Mm-hmm. I think it was a really great, diverse group that I think held both identities that have been historically marginalized and privileged identities. And so there was a lot of opportunity to kind of dissect that in a variety of ways for all of us to learn from each other and engage in how it applied to our work. And lots of changes came from that whole crew of, policies and things that they applied locally in their departments. So, yeah.
That's cool.
And Stacy, you were in development at the time, yes?
I was in university development. I was the director of finance and administration for the development office. And the development office at UCSF is centralized. So I also had responsibility for the UCSF Foundation, which I believe is a little bit different at Berkeley, that it's decentralized, but UCSF is centralized.
Stacy, can we take a walk down memory lane and give us your origin story for our listeners?
Sure. So I was born in Los Angeles. My father was born in Los Angeles. He was a student at USC. He was in the Korean War. He basically faked out his age. He entered the Black National Guard. It was segregated at the time. And he was 16. And he didn't have to go to battle or anything. He was an engineer. And my mother was from San Diego, and they met doing some kind of sorority, fraternity party in LA. And I will never forget this. They had me, and he was working probably 2 jobs at SC. And he said a young girl, and that's part of my origin story. I am transgender and came out after Haas. So I physically transitioned in the late 90s, and I graduated from Haas in 1990.
That's beautiful. Can you tell us a little bit about your career, since, I guess, before Haas and after Haas?
So I followed in my father's footsteps. And so I would never recommend this to anyone, but this is how confident I was. I applied to one university, and the only university I applied to was USC. And I had no thought, of course I would get in, right. And I did. And I mean, talk about risky, but that tells you a little bit about sort of how I was brought up. And I started as a psych major and decided to change my major and ended up in the studio arts. So from there, I started graduate school at the U of A in sculpture. And I needed to be practical, basically, to say, okay, what is your path here? And usually the path with, masters is you teach and then you start a studio practice. And I just didn't see it for myself. And so I left graduate school, went back to LA, and then I worked at the LA Times in customer service. I worked at UCLA Extension, and then I came up to San Francisco with a friend. And I always wanted, ever since a little kid, is on vacations, we'd always come up to the Bay Area and specifically San Francisco. At my age, that's, I think there was a time when the flower children were in, I was just always fascinated by all of that. And so I said, I'm just going to move here. And I landed a job at HBO. At the time, they were owned by Time Inc. At the time. It was just Time Inc. And it was the sales and marketing office, very small in Embarcadero. And basically, I was mentored. People sort of took me under their wing and said, you're very smart. You're smarter than most of the people in this office. I mean, you make some money, go to business school. And
that's awesome.
So I said, okay. And I really was an artist going to business school. So I had to back up and take some calculus classes and extension and all that kind of stuff. And my friends were laughing at me because I just kept going. And, I got advanced accounting and I got an A in it, later. That's just who I am.
And so did you only apply to Haas? I'm really curious.
Almost. I didn't apply very many places. But Haas was, to me, it was about, again, my age. There's this nostalgia about being in the place where free speech happened, and being in a place where a very good reputation. And I applied myself, meaning, it wasn't natural necessarily. I worked really, really hard. I even got a tutor one time, sort of for the quant stuff. But the job at HBO was sales and marketing. And I'm like, well, I kind of, from a practical standpoint, I kind of already know that, but let me do something that I don't know how to do. And I just dove right into it. So my summer internship, I thought, well, let me marry the two. So I did an internship with Citibank in marketing, but at the time, marketing for Citibank was designing checks. I'm like, no, no. Marketing for a bank. And so this is another funny story. My family grew up with Pepsi. I mean, it's not really funny. They put Pepsi in baby bottles.
Baby bottles,
and
yep.
So I'm like, okay, Pepsi's recruiting. And again, in my sort of boldness, the CEO of PepsiCo was on the cover of Fortune. And I decided, let me write this guy. Because at the time, my first year, I was with the Black Student Union and other folks. And my first year, I had written something about what we didn't call it diversity and inclusion at the time. But as a student, I got published in the Wall Street Journal for, I think I was commenting on George Bush. So I wrote this guy, it's probably for my dad, like, you just keep pushing forward. And believe it or not, even though I had gotten an interview set up, I literally got a letter from John Scully, who was the CEO at the time. And somebody had called me and said, we got this letter and we want to set up an interview for you. And it was amazing. I said, well, thank you. I actually already have an interview, but I learned that like writing campaigns, they work.
That's incredible.
That is inspirational. Yeah.
So I started as a senior business planner right out of business school in finance in the San Francisco office of Pepsi Cola, which is the bottling operation.
So looking back, Stacy, in your introduction, you mentioned that you are transgender. And I was sharing with Sean that when you grow up with not a lot of representation of you in the media, there are these kind of moments that might stand out as you're developing as a young person. And for me, one of those moments was like seeing a Red Hot Chili Peppers video for Fight Like a Brave, where they have extensive footage of Mexica dancers at Plaza Olvera in LA. And then like Tupac had a reference in one of his songs that like it wouldn't be LA without Mexicans, right? Like, so there was these moments of like, oh, they know I exist. You know, I don't see myself anywhere in popular media, but there are these connections of like a reality check of sorts. And I'm wondering, you know, as somebody who transitioned after Haas, if there were moments earlier in your life that you saw yourself reflected or connected to something that was like, that's me, that's who I am, but just not having the language or space representation in ways of, as a path forward, maybe. Or if you could share some of what your experience was like, given that it was a different era and generation.
In terms of seeing myself, I think I will say this. I identify more with being African American and even being in the Black Student Union as a person of color. I'm not going to find the right professional words, but Alida, you know what it's intersectionality. Thank you for myself. Intersectionality. And so though growing up, even in Haas, I mean, we're really taught like the most important thing that we can do, meaning in my family particularly my mother, is vote, right? Civic engagement has always been really, really important to me. I mean, I think even when I was 12, decided that my mom dropped me off and I wanted to go to a Shirley Chisholm. She was running for president and I went to a Shirley Chisholm rally. I mean, those are the kinds of things. That's who I still continue to look for. It wasn't until later on when I saw really a photographer who did basically a photo book of trans people that I looked at it, and to your point about images, like, but this is a little different. I'm like, oh, that's what I am, right? And I think some folks in the trans community can relate to that, and others will tell you these other stories. I mean, I've always known since I was 5, but it wasn't even in sort of my walk now in life. That's not front and center necessarily. And so I'm out and I'm not out, if that makes any sense. And I think literally, you know, people tell you this, as you age, you get a different perspective. And so I think early on, I would not necessarily come out after I physically transitioned. My thought was, it's private. This is not what I'm talking about. But I feel this is a moment. I think this is a moment that I can lend my voice, and I have lent my voice. I mean, folks have reached out to me, and years ago I did some media, and now I'm beginning to do a little bit more. But long-winded way to get to kind of your question. Even now, it is it is Indigenous artists and writers who are out there pushing the boundaries of their art, and their politics is sort of where I'm landing right now after I've retired and don't have to think about, you know, debits and credits.
You know, speaking of artists, can you share with us a little bit about your writings and your work?
I'm not a slam poet, so I don't have anything memorized. So I finished a full-length manuscript on African American women in the military, and now I'm writing a sci-fi full-length poem. But the military has been sort of a central theme in my family. I'm probably fourth generation. I mean, great grandfathers were in the Union Army and they're Buffalo Soldiers and that kind of thing. And even first cousins, second cousins, third cousins. And so when I think his name was Miley, I don't know, when the general said he shouldn't have been there, when he apologized for walking the walk with President Trump, basically I had a poem that repeated, somebody shouldn't have been there, right? Somebody shouldn't have been there. Somebody's knee shouldn't have been on somebody's neck. They shouldn't have been there. I mean, that if you know, it was sort of repetitive that way. And so I haven't memorized it, but I think you get the gist of where I was going.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So maybe if we can have you speak a little bit about, well, I'll say one of my areas of interest of inviting you in and asking you to share your voice was also some of the conversations you and I have had around, you know, workplace practices and things that you had to navigate before there were real policies in place to support that transition, including name. And so I'm wondering if there are, you know, anything that you're reflecting on now in this moment, as you were saying, that you're lending your voice vis-a-vis what your experience was, you know, in the 90s, and any insights that you have around that wisdom that comes with age and time as well, based on what you're observing, you know, this kind of celebration that there is now and kind of more increased awareness around, you know, the threats to transgender, you know, people of color in particular.
Well, you know, it's a really interesting topic because folks who have chosen to physically transition, and I've done that, and with age, you begin to blend in, right? And almost that's, as a kid and going through struggles, that's what you've always wanted, right? You don't want to announce this is what I've always wanted. This is who I am, right? I am a Black man.
Right.
But I don't think it's any different then or now that this is a very private decision with very public consequences. And regardless of folks who are allies, and it's much more prevalent now that celebrities have come out, that celebrity, right? I mean, I know that there have mostly male, born male, so trans women now or in transition, who I even worked for a trans woman who, you know, was a CEO, and there are a different struggle, partially because of just the dynamics of hormones, is that it's more difficult for them to pass, if at all. And the interesting thing, I was a mayoral appointee on the San Francisco Transgender Civil Rights Implementation Task Force way back when. And I will tell you, white trans women, they have a hard time letting go of that privilege that they are so used to. And that's their awakening.
Well, to be more specific, I remember us having conversations about even having your information from Haas transferred over to UCSF under your name and having to go through some loops and having your own folks at UCSF step in to support you in making that happen, because it was before there were some clear policies in place. And so as we're thinking about what are, you know, kind of tweaks in the workplace that can be made to support folks, or that on the contrary, that accidentally out people who don't want to be outed, right? So kind of taking those kinds of things into consideration.
I think that is the most important thing. It's almost like you need to ask somebody for a hug, right? I mean, if you're a huggy person, you need to ask permission. I mean, just because someone is trans and you know that they are and they're out, that still does, you still need to ask permission, right? It's really, really important to ask permission and not assume, right, that because you know, right, or you've been a part of their life before and now, it's important to fight for that. The situation you're referencing is I, for the longest time, did not engage with USC or Haas for that matter, because they continued to send me alumni stuff in my old name. And Stacy is not my old name by any, it's a nickname, but it's not my birth name. And I went through all of the things that you're supposed to, I got my records changed for whatever reason, and I don't know why. Alumni databases don't sync up with anything else. And that just pissed me off. And it's actually triggering, and it's been a while for me. It was still triggering. Like, I don't know how many times I've tried to send emails or write to alumni associations or what have you. Well, the person you're talking about, he no longer works at UCSF, but he was a senior director of alumni relations, and he was very tied in with all of the alumni directors in all different schools. And he happened to be tied into USC and UC Berkeley. And I don't know how we got into this, but I had a conversation with him and I said, this is really upsetting. I'd love to engage, but, they won't change my name. He literally became an advocate to, I will handle it. That next day, it was done.
Wow.
And that was the intervention.
Yeah.
I have to follow up that thought with something that you brought up, this idea of public and private, right? I mean, for transgender people, it is very much a private matter. But then there is this conflict of interest where we need to push for public policies and push for change to accommodate, right? To be mindful of transgender people. How do you reconcile that private public conflict? Or what are some ways, people can, or allies, or just as a society, we can help with that without outing people?
So I would say it's not dissimilar from being an ally of a person of color, that it is the ally's job, if you will, to educate themselves on what history and current affairs and what the issues are. And it's really, it's not either the person of color and or the trans person's job to necessarily educate. So I would say that's number one.
Thank you, Stacy, for kind of reinforcing that the onus really is on allies to learn for ourselves, right? How we can do better in all of these spaces. I think it's also worth noting, you mentioned a very clear difference between the experience of a trans woman and a trans male, right? In terms of privilege or their ability to pass. And I just want to also take into consideration that the umbrella, also includes folks who might be gender fluid or non-conforming. And so there's multiple layers and folks who are all included in the trans umbrella that would have potentially different needs that we need to be mindful of, right? Like use of pronouns is one example, the single-use restrooms to be gender neutral, all those sorts of things that are now state policy, right? But I think, I wonder, Sean, if what you're asking about is how do we make sure we're making informed decisions for the trans community without outing somebody by including them at the table in making those informed decisions? Like I asked you for permission before I shared with the rest of the team your identity to make sure that this was a platform you wanted to share that identity within.
Yeah, and I think, again, I can go back to the asking permission. I mean, earlier on, I didn't consider myself an activist, but if you look back at the things that I was doing, I was speaking, I was on the board of the, at the time, the San Francisco LGBT project. I've always been interested in civil engagement. And so when I heard that there was a commission that was a task force really, that was really going to advise the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, at the time it was Mark Leno's task force, I talked to my wife who was connected to someone. And so everybody was out at the time. I think it's a constant for me anyway, and I can't speak for anybody else. For me, it's not, I don't have an answer, the same answer every time. I think the situation is different, and it really depends on the situation and who's asking the question and how I feel about that person and my sussing out, if you will, of the situation. And I am just at a point right now where I'm okay talking about this in sort of an alumni setting. My coming out in my corporate environment, I mean, they did some things that were amazing. The company doesn't exist anymore, but after Pepsi, I went to a company called AirTouch Communications, and I was in corporate finance staff there. And what we ended up doing in consultation with someone else is, and some folks, when I say this story, they go, "What?" But I thought at the time, they basically decided that I could use the bathroom. And that was at OneHaas. That building is still there, but they don't occupy it. And I thought it was perfectly fine. And I ran into a couple of times the CEO and the CFO, and there was sort of this moment of, like, on both sides, but oh, you're in the male bathroom. Oh, okay. And when I had my first surgery, they, everybody in my team, and even they made an announcement, right, to folks that I work with, because I was in a relatively high profile position. So it wasn't anything that I could, just sort of slink and nobody would see, what was going on. I don't know how that works today. I don't know if I'm glad you mentioned gender fluid folk. There are folks who they won't, and they're choosing not to physically transition. And so there is no one size fit all. There just really is not. And I think that's in the workplace. I think that's the most important thing. People who can influence, right, who are in management position and who can influence policy, that literally it's very fluid, and that they have to engage their employees with heart, right? We're human beings. When I was first transitioning, this should not be the case, but because I was, okay, I'm an overachiever, because I was a solid performer, that it made a difference. That should not be the case, right? I mean, you should be able to be a marginal performer, and folks should be able to make an accommodation, whatever that means in the moment. And I guess humans are humans, right? I mean, it's human nature. And I can sort of visualize for myself trying to make that distinction between performance and what's the right thing to do with respect to someone's humanity. So I don't know what the answer is there, but I do know it's real.
In all these years of working and advising, do you have any advice for Haas alumni who may be in positions of power at their companies, who may be able to influence change? How should they go about it?
And maybe even including aspiring allies who don't yet know how to be an ally, but have that position of power or influence.
It's a fair question, and I'm just an individual who can just talk about my own personal experience. I haven't. Even though I was on the employment on the task force, basically I chose to be on the employment committee. And so this is always something that I've thought about and engaged on. And I'm going to come up short on that one. I don't know if there is an answer other than please follow the law.
Yay! New Supreme Court decision.
I'm going to take the other side for a moment. I mean, I don't want to assume that all of the audience is necessarily, at the same place, right? That you might be, or that I am, or Sean, you're asking very, I can tell by the way that you're asking the question, you're open. You really just want to know. And I think that's all I can say is that's really the spirit of, so I think each situation, I think each company is different. I don't know if anybody is teaching this in business school, but I would hope that if they haven't, I don't know what academic would take it on, but I would hope that somebody is taking it on because it's very complex.
Yeah. Thank you for being thoughtful about it. And I appreciate that there is no perfect answer. And at the same time, I imagine there are a number of resources and toolkits that, kind of coming back to your original point, Stacy, of like that folks can Google and read and inform themselves with. And I think the value of a podcast like this one is, you might remember, Stacy, in our class on unconscious bias, that one of the kind of primary interventions was, surround yourself with more examples and exemplars of ways of being X identity, right? And that intersectionality that you referenced earlier. And so I think that even by humanizing, by sharing your story, right? This is part of my motivation in participating and in suggesting you in this series is that it allows somebody to have at least a connection to a person that is trans, right? If they don't know of somebody in their personal circle, right? Because I sometimes hear like, oh, I don't know anybody. I'm like, you just don't know that you don't know, right? And sometimes that's also the case. But being able to hear your story of like having such a strong identity of civic duty, of, African-American representation, having that being at the forefront, having all of your business acumen, right? And this is another part of who you are, right? And what you've had to navigate in your life. And I think it just allows for somebody to have one more possibility of what that experience might look like, right? In the full range of what trans lives might be about, or, in every kind of industry and racial makeup and gender identity.
I will say this as well. We didn't talk about it. I mean, could be listeners who have thought about transitioning or in the process of transitioning as well. I recall, you think about your family and your loved ones, but I recall I had a very close relationship with my managing director at the time. And she shared with me, she said, I just got to tell you this. I feel like I'm going through a little death, meaning, and people do feel that way when you are connected to this other person and this image of this person, and you want to support them, and that person isn't going to show up tomorrow, right? It's going to be it's going to look like something else, and you may engage with that person differently. And so even in the workplace, your employer is also transitioning as well. And so having space for that, of thinking about that and giving people time, right? I can say this now at 60, but giving people time to adjust is also happened to me. And I think it sometimes you can get impatient, but everybody is transitioning around you.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I know that I try to be really transparent about stumbles I've had to normalize and normalize that we all stumble and that you still can get up and keep trying and working at being a good ally. And I'll say that I noticed for myself, I struggle with misgendering folks when I've known them before and after versus when I've just known them after a transition. And each time I catch myself and I always feel horrible for it, right? And it's like that immediate, like, oh, I did it. And here I am, right? And I've experienced friends and loved ones being very forgiving of me, but I imagine it's a microaggression that accumulates, right? That it's still grating of like, this person just called me by the wrong gender again. It's like, oh, I did that, and so, yeah, I hear you. I think that it's in the moment, I imagine it's really challenging for folks to continue to have that patience and for it to not feel hurtful. I would imagine it would feel hurtful if somebody's essentially saying, I'm grieving a loss when you feel like I'm aligned with who I've always been, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important perspective that you share, Stacy. And this is something I touched upon in a prior episode with another alumni, Ace Patterson. And to a similar point, he says, you have to be willing to make mistakes, right, for change to happen. And what I hope listeners don't take away from our conversation is that they don't need to try, right? They need to shy away from those mistakes versus embracing that and knowing that is the right direction forward. Yeah, I think as long as the way I think about it is like, as long as if you're stumbling, you're still stumbling forward, right? don't fall back. But that it's also about the recovery, right? Being willing to hear feedback or that something didn't land the way you thought it was intended. That there is the opportunity for recovery and trust if there is relationship, right? But if somebody shuts down in either direction, right, it makes it more challenging to continue to grow. And I appreciate that I think what you're saying, Stacy, is like now you have an ability to look back in a way that maybe as you were going through it was harder to hear or to take or to be in relationship with somebody. But I do hope that we all continue to be students always, and confidence without attitude, I think, is a real key part of also what you're sharing in terms of like the humility aspect of just embracing that we know some things, right? And we know we're good at them, and no need to kind of shut anybody down in the process. This has been so informative. I want to thank you both for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Really good to see you, Stacy.
Good seeing you too.
Take care. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the OneHaas Alumni Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Stacy's work, please check out his website at snjackson.com. That's S as in Stacy, N as in Nathaniel, Jackson.com. If you enjoyed our show today, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player and give us your rating and review. Relatedly, if you would like to hear more about current student perspectives, please check out our sister podcast here at Haas, or you can subscribe to our monthly podcast newsletter on onehaas.org. Until next time, go Bears.